They know when to go.
You guys
Do we need to just bring one over like that?
I thought so. We can.
Shorten the whole thing just by 2 tables.
Yeah, just bring that black table up.
Push out that.
Push her up.
I guess so.
What are we doing this?
Hi.
So you can-
Hi. How are you
so
doing?
Alex can hear you.
I'm surprised I'm not drooling. I just got out of
Why doesn't he
I'm
use a
pretty
big
young.
voice? Well, no, but you guys would have to have big voices.
Well, I do have to leave, so.
How are you keeping?
Okay.
It's just that the
Hanging in
acoustics
there.
are bad.
We have lots of stuff.
How many days now?
Oh, yeah. You're talking about retirement.
Oh,
All set?
Al is doing what you did last time, you just came from the dentist.
oh yeah.
There you go.
Hello, everybody. Yes, move on close. We'll try and have a little bit more intimate group, although I see we all extend our habits we acquired in school of wanting to sit at the back of the class. That's where many of us filter to quite naturally. Welcome to the second in the series of UNBC Northwest Campus's public presentation series. Today we're fortunate enough to have one of our own professors, Dr. Alex Lautensach, lead a discussion. Alex, as many of you know, is a professor in the School of Education and is very active in a number of environmental and social justice issues and scholarly research with his wife Sabina. You may have caught their human security presentation a year or two ago. I specifically asked Alex to take up this exploration of the LEAP Manifesto. This is one of the more recent initiatives to provide a vision of an alternate future, not just no to industrial progress or certain political movements, but to actually engage in some constructive visioning to show us perhaps an optimistic view of what we can do. I heard a similar discussion on CBC Radio's The Current yesterday, in which David Boyd discussed his recent book, The Optimistic Environmentalist. Those are not an oxymoronic set of terms, apparently. So about a month ago, there was some discussion of this new initiative, and so I've asked Alex to lead us through it. What is the LEAP Manifesto, Dr. Lautensach?
Thank you, Phil, for the introduction. Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Phil said, I'm teaching teachers in my day job, but one of my research interests consists of topics related to human security. And this LEAP Manifesto qualifies as much as anything as a topic related to human security. Before I launch into any more introduction, I'd like us to introduce ourselves as we go around, just very briefly, and maybe a sentence on why you're interested in attending.
Oh, yeah, I'm Al Lehman. I'm a retired teacher, and I've been following environmental issues since I read The Limits to Growth in 1972.
Yes, Karen Dodisenko. I'm interested in this because there's so much going on the planet right now that's good. We're looking at big change, and I want to go in the right direction.
I'm Eileen Thomas. I'm a retired medical laboratory technologist, and I've come to all these things because I find them all very interesting.
Happy to have you.
I'm Doug Foster. I read an article by Conrad Black about the LEAP Manifesto, so I thought I'd get the other side of the story.
I'm Pat Onehill. I read about this, that you care for the land, and that brings me here.
I'm Kelly Klein. I have come to a number of these lectures and really enjoyed them. And I didn't know what the LEAP Manifesto was. I just thought I would come and find out.
I'm Judy Chrysler, and I invited him to come because I said, I don't know what the LEAP Manifesto is, but with in mind, like thinking about my first environmental book was Diet for a Small Planet. It's very sticky, and it's well used, and it was the first edition, and I still abide by it about being a vegetarian to live smaller on the planet. Live simply so others may simply live. Beyond that, I'm thirsty ears.
Great book.
I have the book too.
Yeah.
Sabina Lautensach, and I'm an environmental anarchist, so anything that has manifesto in its title is of great interest.
Margaret Vanderberg, I come to these lectures just to do a little mind stretching. I don't know what it is.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to make this event rather interactive, rather than going into your standard academic monologue with passive listening. I'd like you to contribute as much as you feel you want to, interrupt, chime in. That's the format I would prefer. And I would love to just sit right there to complete the circle, but this is video streamed and recorded, and I've got this cage here. So I'm so sorry, but I have to stay within the cage. To start off, perhaps, the background of the document, background of the manifesto, is something I'm still trying to find out more about. There are probably people in this room who know more about the background than I. The manifesto started as a programmatic document in circles that were very much concerned with social justice and concerned with the fact that the NDP has perhaps turned away in view of election strategies. So this is a document that attempts to draw Canadians who are interested in some kind of progressive policy back towards sustainability, security, social justice. And the document has been endorsed by David Suzuki, Naomi Klein, two names that I remember. So it is gaining support publicly. The reason why I'm interested in it is because it addresses an issue that it's very close to my heart. And that issue is summarized in this diagram up here. I don't know how many of you have seen this before. Anybody? It is a diagram from a recent publication, updated publication by researchers from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, University of Stockholm. And what these people are into is sustainable human security in a way that highlights the opportunities that are still open to humanity in light of the overshoot situation that we're in. And overshoot is basically the title of this. What this diagram describes is 9 boundaries, which are described here as sectors in the circle, environmental boundaries, and they can be global, they can also be regional and local. But if you look at the labels, I hope you can read them from where you are. Change in land use, freshwater use, nitrogen phosphorus cycle, ocean acidification, climate change, and so on. These are all boundaries. And some of them we have transgressed collectively, humanity. Mostly biodiversity loss and the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen appropriation from the atmosphere in the manufacture of fertilizer is a boundary that has been transgressed for quite some time. And up here is climate change, which is now going ahead, to some extent unstoppable. The green area is what they call safe operating space. And you can see these 3 boundaries. With respect to those, humanity has transgressed the safe operating space. There are some others where we're still in the green, and 2 remaining ones where we're still trying to find out where we are. The measurements, the quantitation is difficult. Anyway, that is the diagram for me that describes best the situation of ecological overshoot that we find ourselves in. And that has been the case since about the mid-1980s. So it's nothing new, really. It's just getting worse. What I had in mind is that we don't go through the manifesto step by step. There are 15 demands in the manifesto, but rather what I thought we might do is divided up into areas. And these are the areas that I could find that these demands relate to. And we'll go through these step by step. I've got about a slide for each. And everybody just chimes in. If you find that the manifesto doesn't go far enough, or if you find it misses the point, it would be great to hear from you.
Alex, before we start, maybe could you give us a little more background? Is this a uniquely Canadian initiative, or is it?
It is a Canadian
international?
initiative,
Okay.
yes. Trying to gain attention globally, which is now easily done with the internet, but it is originated with Canadians. And it centers on Canadian politics and policy. Doesn't mean it doesn't have global significance and global applicability. Very appropriately, the document starts with the right of Indigenous peoples. A couple of days ago, some people down south still celebrated Columbus Day. You probably noticed. I personally think there's nothing to celebrate about that, and certainly not from the point of view of Indigenous peoples. Charter calls for Manifesto, sorry, calls for fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm not too sure what that declaration entails, but I'm pretty sure that there's much to be done in terms of Canadian politics to come even close to what it calls for. The ongoing disputes about land use and resource use, I can speak for themselves. Here's a slide that I just had to put in because I think it also speaks for itself. The next area is energy, and this is a focus point. This is one of the emphases that the manifesto places. It's got 3 demands, number 2, number 4, number 5, that all have to do with energy. And I'll let you read those 3, and in the meantime, I'll give you some hard copies, which I forgot.
We'll share.
Okay. There's an extra one here.
Okay, I'll share it with a friend. Thank you.
So the emphasis on energy use is very much to do with climate change mitigation. I'm sorry, Ed, I just gave away my last copy. But, oh, you've got one. Okay, good. Very much on clean energy, mitigative policies. If you want a slogan that summarizes what the manifesto calls for here is keep it in the ground. And I think that is very sane, much more reasonable than what I heard any other politicians say. Well, maybe except for Elizabeth, she's sort of separate. But anybody have a comment on this? Do you think it goes far enough or too far? Al?
Nothing to do with too far, but particularly communities operating their own clean energy systems. There are some very interesting plans that have been implemented in various places, and I can't name them offhand, places where a community would buy something like a windmill, one of those really huge ones, and maybe it costs $2 million or something like that. And they put it up, and once the capital's paid off, then they use that as collateral to build another one or to help another community build one, and so on. And it's kind of a radiant expansion of the system. It struck me as being really a sensible, sane way of implementing clean energy projects.
And the sensible feature is that you save yourself all the transmission costs if you reduce energy management to small-scale, community-based systems. Resource extraction. Of course, these are all related, and resource extraction cannot be separated from energy policies. But this is a statement that I can identify with quite a lot because it situates Canada within the global context. If you wouldn't want it in your backyard, then it doesn't belong in anyone's. The picture, I believe, is from China. And as much as we shrink back from that kind of view of the future, we wouldn't wish it on the Chinese either, would we? And after all, we've been benefiting enormously from their pollution during the last couple of decades, which is not fair. Infrastructure, another one that I can wholly identify with, especially in the view of our isolated geographical situation here in the Northwest. Every time there's a snowstorm, this becomes, well, very, very close to reality. And I know Phil years ago wrote a letter. I still have it. I really like that letter that you wrote to, was it to CN, regarding the, well, the movement, the trains for the public rather than trains for wood chips. And I don't think you ever got an answer back. Right. Of course, we would love to have more effective train service to the main campus from the UNBC perspective. It's not going to happen anytime soon, obviously. But in the long run, especially in terms of, in view of climate change mitigation, this status of the car will have to change in Canadian society. It is a very deep-rooted ideal, and it has to go. And I doubt whether we'll all be driving electric cars. Education and social services, I lump these two together, even though I see, I would have personally a few things to add in terms of education and social services. This is about training and resources for workers in carbon-intensive jobs, which is surely an important issue, but for me as an educationist, there's a whole lot more to education than just training people for jobs. And both of these demands really just focus on that aspect.
I'm surprised about number 7 because we already have really good statistics and research done into the employment situation in green industries. And that already way surpasses all the numbers for example, the tar sands and things like that. So in a way, they're a little bit behind here because that has already been shown that if you get into the green industry and you get a job there, you'll be much better off. And I think the sector now employs about 4 or 5% more in terms of numbers than any of the carbon-intensive jobs that are around right now. So there's already been a leap forward.
What I'm hearing you say is that the manifesto could call for more here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's, and they could perhaps be a little bit more specific what they're actually against. For instance, the subsidies of the fossil fuel industry sector. That just has to go. It costs everybody money and it contributes to a bad thing. So,
I think too, a couple of things regarding that. In traditional accounting, there are a lot of costs that are not accounted for with regard to the carbon economy. Although that could possibly be true with respect to green energy in terms of the manufacture of the tools. And just an item of humor, there are more solar workers than there are cowboys in Texas now.
Yeah, the accounting of externality costs is a very sore point in mainstream economics. And again, they could be more explicit that that is actually the target that they want to see a change in. Phil?
I think number 12 is useful in pointing out that the service sector, specifically social services, is a green sector, a low carbon contribution to the economy, because we hear so much about the service sector just being flipping hamburgers at minimum wage, but in fact, you know, these are very constructive roles that are not degrading the environment while, you know, promoting humanity. And I think it's a real useful link to make.
And providing a wealth of human security. I particularly look at the last sentence here. National childcare programs are a reality in many countries, countries that in many respects are much more civilized than Canada. They're affordable and they do a whole lot of goods in terms of getting children the right start to enter the school system. I'm not a parent myself, but about half of my students are parents. And I know the difficulties, logistic difficulties that they have trying to balance the parenting responsibilities with their personal growth and development plans. That's where Canadian society can make a whole lot more difference in a positive way. Food. This is another one of those where I would have a whole lot more to say. Sorry,
Karen,
somebody had their hand up?
Sorry,
Karen.
Just on the education thing, you were focusing on the training and resources for workers, but how much of that training and education is based on teaching you why we need energy, clean energy jobs? Because so much in the high schools and our education is centered around jobs rather than understanding the whole system. About how much, why we're polluting everything, why we, like even in government, that they promote jobs, but not clean jobs.
As soon as education gets too much into the why questions, they attract criticism from people who publicly endorse the opinion that education is nothing but training people for employment. Those kind of voices are always there. And we have to be careful in pursuing the whys in a sort of measured and defensible way. But on the other hand, I think you've raised a very important point, and that is that even if you do focus on the employment sector and the job market, if you want to call it that way, what too many curricula do is focus on the status quo of the job market and not the future. And a look at the future, I think, would shift the priorities in a fundamental way and a lot more prudent way than just by trying to cater to the status quo under the implicit assumption that it's always going to stay like this, which we are sure it is not.
Yeah, it's very interesting that it was just this morning I was reading on the internet that self-driving vehicles are now expanding into the industrial sector, so that there are going to be city buses and dump trucks and everything else that have nobody running except somebody in front of a computer screen.
Listening to that, thinking that plays into the automaton, not the no thinking, whole populations that don't think.
So you watch the big truck running through town training drivers, you know. How long are those guys going to be working?
Yeah, yeah. And all those heavy machinery operators. Yeah. Yeah, I don't see anybody planning ahead in that regard. And the implication is always that this is progress, right? So how can we possibly argue against it? Well, there isn't just one kind of progress. And the manifesto, I think, one of its key messages is that this is a progress that we would all benefit from as Canadians. And there are other kinds of progress that actually do a lot more harm than good. Teresa?
Yeah, I really like what you said about changing like the outcome in the end when you're doing the curriculum, because it's like the safety, right? A lot of the jobs and the training around this industry is all around safety, and so they're always asking themselves, is it safe? There's always a chance being done, is it safe at the end of the day? So when you would apply it to like green, is it green? You know, is it green at the end of the day? Like you said, would really do a lot. So
Yeah.
it's a really good point that you made.
I think that's a word that the manifesto deliberately avoids, is the word green. And I wish they would at least replace it with the word secure, but they don't do that either. So yeah, I take your point. There's a little bit missing there in that direction. Food. They're arguing for localized, ecologically-based food production, no reliance on fossil fuels. So these are all undeniable goods, I would suggest, but they only mention health in passing. It is there, and affordability. I think there's a whole lot more to be said about the future of food policies, where they should go, where it would be prudent to direct them, in terms of impending shortages, perhaps, impending problems with distribution, spoilage, especially in view of the fact that the transportation sector will be severely affected by peak oil. The distribution of food is going to be problematic. And if people don't produce more of it locally, there will be shortages, inevitably, I think. Apart from all the health aspects that the picture is trying to illustrate. The domination by large-scale agricultural industries is definitely counterproductive. I think we all have experienced that the best tasting food in our lives hardly ever comes from large-scale industrial production. It comes from, well, smaller sources.
Am I to assume ecologically based agricultural system, it means organic pest control?
I think that's part of it.
Okay, I just want to make sure that that's what ecologically based, that's, as my dad would say, airy-fairy, Judy. I mean, because it's what it means to each of us individually, ecologically based, because that's not legally a legal term. It's everybody's head, what's in it, what they perceive.
You touch on a general shortcoming that is obvious in this manifesto, in that it supplants reasonable concepts with very brief catchphrases and even terms, single terms, that are easily misinterpreted.
Yeah.
I think they did that for the sake of brevity, but they lost some of their message in the process. And this is a good example.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think a term like ecologically based agriculture is great for a 20-word statement, but backing that up, there's going to be quite a bit more detail.
Yeah.
And see, I would argue that it's not always organic or pesticide-free. Depends on what the local situation is in terms of what are the relative dangers of pollution versus habitat loss. Because if you go organic, you might have to convert more natural ecosystems to provide the land available to produce the food that's necessary. So sometimes you may wish to incorporate, let's say, herbicides rather than extensive plowing in larger land areas. So I think they're quite purposely using general vague terms like ecologically based.
Well, case in point along that line, it drives me nuts every winter when I buy organic red peppers from Israel. I don't know if anybody's looked at the sticky, and it's like, that's not organic. I mean, it's flowing all that way. I've never been to Israel, but my red peppers have. So I balance that with what you mean. Like, I would rather buy a local red pepper that may have had soap and other things applied to the soil even.
You know, I take bigger issue with more affordable. I think
Yes.
our food is underpriced the way it is, especially if it is to be locally produced and farm workers paid a living wage.
If we do away with the subsidies, that would probably change. And for many in Canadian society, much food would become unaffordable given the subsidies are taken away. And then this would be much more of an issue. I guess the implication here is that given the fact that these subsidies are unsustainable, affordability is a serious issue in the future, not now.
I think the localized part would help an awful lot there too, because it's the subsidies to big industry makes it expensive because they pocket it. It goes into their investors' pockets. We're here, if we're working in our own food production, then it's our jobs that we're getting paid to produce our own food.
Yeah, and it's easy to then dress that up, if there is money coming from central government, dress it up as community development aid and not a subsidy for a particular kind of food production.
And that goes into our infrastructure thing as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, I find that they're behind the times. Research has shown that over the last 5 years, the number of farmers markets has gone up more than 80% in Canada and more than 250% in the United States. And that the increase of small farms between 1 acre to 5 acres is tenfold. And a lot of people would actually say they'd rather go to buy locally, and that includes places like New York City, and not just places in Alberta, countryside or whatever it is. And so people have already started to make the choice away from these big business, agricultural, industrial kind of food producing companies. But they have all done this without subsidies. So what could be done if we actually place the right emphasis on the right places and the right people,
right,
and the right products?
Yeah. Thank you for that. So it's taking away subsidies is not entirely going to result in shortages, but it also results in a whole lot of positive incentives.
I think
yeah.
If we could get this in terrace, if we could get a subsidy of $200,000 to have a building where we can have a year-round farmers market in it and do these sorts of things, it would be phenomenal.
Community development.
Yeah. Because then we could actually ask Save-On, you take our local food produce and sell it there, because we have enough.
What I think I'm hearing here from all these comments is, and thank you for all these contributions. I think they're great ideas. But what there seems to be a need for a correct interpretation and follow-up of all the implied statements that are there. So we need a background document, which I don't think exists at the moment. But the manifesto needs a basis to stand on, a background document of I don't know how many pages, but then each of these demands would at the bottom have a reference, see section 5.2 in the background document, where all these things are elaborated and explained and interpreted correctly. I think that would lead to a greater amount of public support, especially from people who find fault with particular phrasings and terms and not sure how those are to be interpreted.
Maybe it should go the other way, Alex, and instead of having a generic background document, that every community needs to develop its own action plan that interprets it in the sorts of examples people have been putting forth here.
Yeah, well, the action plan, of course, is in the long run indispensable. You need community action. But without a solid basis to help with the interpretation of these things, wouldn't we be running the danger of diverse interpretations, contradictory interpretations, that then might lead to some kind of paralysis? So maybe both would be a good thing. Global movement of goods and people. This is another one of those that puts us into the international context. And I don't know how much you followed the news on the TPP, wasn't it? And the disastrous consequences of that latest achievement of our current government. trade deals have to be redesigned, revised, revisited. And I am personally not sure at all where the political power and initiative should be coming from to drive that. Because the people who are driving them at the moment are so powerful and so opaque. I use that word as opposite to transparent. So untouchable in terms of our political decision-making process. This is one of those areas where the manifesto, as much as I agree with it and identify with it, but this is going to be an extremely uphill battle, if it ever even happens. Lots of NGOs, of course, are already participating in that battle, but I think we all see from the news over the past decade what an uneven playing field that is taking place on. Refugees is something that isn't really attracting much attention in the Canadian media. It's starting now with the pictures from the Mediterranean coming in. But I think this is an area that we can expect some significant change over the next decade or so, as many heavily populated areas worldwide are becoming uninhabitable as a result of climate change, sea level rise, you name it. But those changes are usually going to be displacing people rather than attracting people. And guess where they want to go? Number one choice of destination is still the United States. I have no idea why, but Canada is up there. People want to come to Canada, and we will be under the obligation to let a certain number in every year, and they need to go somewhere. They can't all go to Toronto and Vancouver. Ultimately, it'll be small communities that will have to open their societies to some extent to welcome these people.
The second sentence of number 11, rebalancing the scales of climate justice by welcoming refugees and migrants. I have a bit of a time in my mind trying to interpret that sentence. Can you help me?
Yeah, this is another one of those that could be a lot more concise. It's up to interpretation. Climate justice is perhaps, yeah, it's one of those very complex concepts. I think what they mean by it is the unjust situation at the moment, interpreted as unjust, under which some areas in the world are severely affected by climate change and are likely to be affected much more severely, whereas other areas sort of see themselves as more or less out of the picture, safe, and on that basis see no reason to change their lifestyles. There is a fundamental unfairness in that situation because the former are much less responsible for the situation than the latter, and yet there is no overarching attempt to equalize the situation. So a rebalance, I think, is the correct choice of term, but what they mean is not just us sending money to Egypt and Syria and other areas, Bangladesh, but welcoming refugees is perhaps not quite enough. We have to prepare to welcome them. We have to make room ahead of time before they knock at the door. Otherwise, it just becomes chaotic, the way that it is now becoming in Europe. And I don't think anybody can claim we didn't see this coming. It is entirely predictable. It is happening predictably, and it is going to escalate predictably. So this is something where all communities up to the national government level can engage in preparative security measures that will go a long way towards a general human security that is based on multicultural ethics. And Sabina and I wrote a paper that's got a lot of views, and the title is "Prepare to be Offended." These people are going to be different from us. They are going to be doing things differently from us. They're going to wear different clothes and behave in different ways from us. And some of them, some people will take offense over. Well, get used to it. It's going to happen. Prepare to be offended. That's something that every one of us can do, assuming we live long enough to see this. Yeah. Any other comments?
This year we've hit 55 million. That's 55 million people on the move. That's almost twice the population of Canada. And that has not just happened yesterday. Yet the United Nations does not recognize environmental refugees, for one. So these people cannot actually apply for any kind of refugee status based on the fact that their country has been run dry, let's say, for droughts, just as bad as floods, no food, conflicts, whatever happens in their place. 55 million people that don't have passports that are actually in between countries, which is, according to the United Nations international law, illegal. People cannot or are not allowed to be stateless. And yet now we have 55 million people that are stateless.
And even if they have passports, the lack of recognition as genuine refugees keeps them out of destination countries who are committed only to genuine refugees who flee political persecution. If they flee climate change, they're migrants, and presumably only considered to want in for economic gain and therefore not to be taken serious. Well, that view is way out of date and is not accommodating the pressures that we're facing.
But at the same time, this one boy that died on the beach is a tragedy, and the 55 million is a statistic.
Yeah.
And that's a real sad and terrible situation at the moment.
You're quoting Stalin, which I'm sure the Manifesto wouldn't agree with.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is the biggest letdown, that paragraph 11, because it's making these people look like they had a choice. They really don't have a choice.
Yeah, I see this particular couple of demands in the Manifesto, I see more room for movement there. Once we get a government that is a little bit more conscious of Canada's reputation in the international community and perhaps a little more prepared to cooperate with the United Nations, I could see some movement going on there on the Canadian scale. Let's hope. The universal basic income is another one of those that many civilized countries in the world have, and the only reason why we don't is probably because our general ethics are so similar to those of the United States, where individual autonomy is considered so much more important than social safety networks. I'm sorry I couldn't get a proper picture there of a woman. I realize women are mentioned here specifically, and rightly so, because the poorest in our society are quite often single female parents. So it's good to see that there, and this is something that is entirely within the realm of possibility as soon as we have a political representation in the country that meets or represents the will of the majority of Canadians.
Are there any countries in the world that currently have a country annual income?
A universal basic income?
Yes, in that sense. Like, is there any countries that
I understand that most of the Scandinavian countries do.
Okay. Switzerland.
Germany, I think, does. I'm not sure about the majority of the EU countries. I think there are probably differences in degree, but the principle they have all bought into it over there. And it's mostly it's much easier in Europe because you've got the tradition of social safety, and government is viewed in a different way by people over there. It's a cultural view that unfortunately never made it across the Atlantic. Should have.
I'd like to add something here with regard to, I don't know how many of you watch Rick Steves' travels in Europe from time to time. It's a pretty fluffy program, but he was in Norway once and he was talking to some cousins about the Norway social safety net and the high taxes and so on. And because he's making a program for an American audience, he's very loath to be too praising of these social democratic systems. But he played a bit of the devil's advocate and suggested that Americans would find Norwegian taxes onerous, and that they would think that having this basic income would diminish entrepreneurial motivation and so forth. And the fellow that he was talking to said, well, we see it quite the opposite. When you have this basic floor under you, then you feel far more comfortable to take entrepreneurial risks. And that was really an interesting comeback. And of course, Rick was just being Rick.
It always depends on who you're speaking for. The majority of the population in those countries doesn't find their taxes onerous. It's the top income sector that is heavily taxed, and they're a minority. This is one of my favorites, and I do want to make sure we all have a good look at that diagram. I know it's a little bit fuzzy, but the diagram compares 4 countries. The 3 bottom bars are Canadian, represent Canadian elections in 2006, 2008, and 2011. And the top 3 bars are Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand, elections in particular recent years. And what the bars represent is the percentage of votes that actually ended up being represented in Parliament. Look at the difference between Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand on the one hand, and Canada on the other. This one, of course, is the longest green bar. Sweden in 2012, 98.6% is what that says, of the votes handed in ended up being represented in Parliament. And here on the Canadian side, we barely get over 50 because of a system that is called first past the post. That's FPTP. Up here we have the acronym PR, proportional representation. That is the difference. And a change in electoral system, that is one of the most promising demands in the manifesto. I think we're well on the way towards it. This initiative has gained so much traction over the past months that I personally am quite optimistic. And who wouldn't want to go from here to there? I think it's a no-brainer. What baffles me is why we still haven't done it. Any comments there?
I'm wondering, Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand, how long have they had that? And has it been in place for a very long time? And have the electorate been basically growing up with this system?
Good question.
And how long will, if Canada were able to change the proportional representation, how long would it take us to get people back to vote?
New Zealand got theirs in the 90s. I think it was mid-90s, wasn't it? But Sweden and Norway have had theirs since the beginning of the 20th century.
How long would it take for New Zealand to wake up, or for the people to start voting in this way?
Yeah.
Because right away I can't imagine that.
Well, New Zealand was hampered by their heritage, which was basically British imperial. And of course the Brits also have first past the post, just like we do. So they were held back by that legacy, which they had to overcome in order to advance to proportional representation. But there was quite an intense public discussion that preceded that step, just like is taking place now.
trying to recall some discussions I had with friends and neighbors when BC had the referendum on an alternative system. I think it was a single transferable vote. And I think a number of people were objecting to the fact that the party that you voted for would designate your representative.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to agree that there should be some room for some kind of public or democratic selection of who those people are.
There is.
Not just assigned by the apparatchiks of a party.
There is. It's not the apparatchiks, it's actually all the party members that agree on the so-called list. And the ranking in the list is debated within the party. The only requirement is for the average citizen that they actually become a member of their favorite party. Then they have that voice, and then they have a say in who's on that list and in what rank.
Within the party selection process. Okay.
Getting rid of first past the post would also eliminate the need or the practice of gerrymandering.
Yeah. Perhaps not entirely eliminate, but very heavily address it. Yeah, yeah, mitigate it.
In majority governments.
Yes.
The last one is one I think that they should have in glowing color, because it addresses the first and foremost objection to the manifesto, and that is we can't possibly afford all this. Well, this demand actually states that we can, and how. And I put it in blue, that's my emphasis. But I've read some commentaries that went into the financial analysis and demonstrate convincingly that if we do all these things right, yes, we can pay for these things. It's really just a matter of shifting the emphasis, where the money goes. Are we needing those fighter jets, or are we needing perhaps universal basic income? Those kinds of choices need to be made.
I was astounded at the debates the other night, watching the candidates drink their bottled water and thinking they were debating gas prices, and that those bottles of water were, in fact, more expensive than the gas prices that they wanted to have.
None of them had their own bottles?
Nathan Cullen did, actually.
I bought this at UNBC.
But it should cost so much more. Think of what you can do with these fossil fuels. It should cost so much
this was
more.
$2. It's ridiculous.
The financial transaction taxes would be utterly brilliant. I mean, currently, with the amount of money that's being shuffled around in derivatives and those kinds of financial instruments that have virtually no value other than to keep moving, is utterly staggering. I think the so-called nominal value of the derivatives market is something like 10 times the world gross domestic product, and so we got to get that out of there to start with. And then you think about if you look at the financial post or something like that on any given day, and the number of stock trades or the value of the stock trades. I mean, if you just charged a penny a share on any of those, you reap in millions and millions of dollars a day. It's a staggering amount of money that people generally aren't aware of being there.
There's a philosopher by the name of Slavoj Žižek in Slovenia who published an interesting paper on the contrast that he sees in the public discourse between discussion of faster than light travel and reform of capitalism. On the one hand, he says faster than light travel is considered something worth discussing, and who knows, maybe those physicists, maybe Einstein wasn't quite right, and we can actually build these rockets, and let's try. Who knows where we can go with them. And on the other hand, reforming capitalism is just an absolute impossibility. No, we cannot touch that. This is the hallmark of our democracy and the basis for all our well-being. Democracy is something we cannot possibly consider revising or rethinking. And he found that rather remarkable, and so do I, that contrast.
I was looking for something on chemical pollution. My understanding, I can't back it up with any facts, is that the amount of stuff being released into the environment is incredible, because you can go to any household and people are maybe moving, perhaps somebody's died, the house is cleaned out. You've got bottles and bottles of chemicals, and really no place to take them.
Yeah.
It could be rat poisons, herbicides, various medical treatments, flea treatments for your animals, stuff that really we have no place to take it.
Yeah.
We're making some progress in terms of prescription medicine. You can return that all. Not everybody does. I think a lot of stuff gets flushed.
Yeah.
And all of this stuff is landing in our environment, not to mention things that are produced on a broad scale, like fire retardants that go into all your upholstery and into all your automobile dashboard components. These are the modern day PCBs. They get into the environment and they do not break down.
Yeah.
Nothing's been done about it. There's very little effort made to keep things out of the environment that are poisonous. You might even argue that a lot of modern allergies and diseases could be stemming from this. We don't know.
And some of these products actually come from industries that are publicly subsidized with your tax money.
Yeah.
What gets me is one particular pollutant, and I've tried to represent it with these pictures down here, and that's plastics. Relatively non-toxic if you compare it with your examples, but I think in the bulk and the amount of plastic that we release into the environment utterly depresses me, as we've now dealt with plastic production and use for, well, 70 years, something like that, 80 years, and we have not learned to either produce or use them sustainably or responsibly. As a species, and we call ourselves Homo sapiens, give me a break. And that's what we do with it. Yeah,
you have to
some of
explain
these.
That upper
Sorry.
Left, you have to explain that upper left photo.
This is a piece of art, and I'm sorry I forgot the name of the artist. It's entitled "Politicians Discuss Climate Change." So my contributions here, but thank you for the chemical pollution aspect. That certainly wasn't in there and should have been, is how we view violence, whether it's legitimized by state authority or otherwise, and what we do about population and its impact. None of those things appear in the manifesto.
I think there's an awful lot missing from that. This is just touching on the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Before I saw the plastic rings in your lower right picture, I thought that one was designed to represent biodiversity, because of course in your first slide, that was the greatest overshoot of our planet's resources, is that we are creating, the next massive extinction of all of these evolutionary experiments that we will never see again on the planet. So
another aspect that definitely would deserve being addressed in a manifesto like this. Yeah, good point. And there's a book out that I can recommend called The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. It's in the UNBC library, and I'm not sure if it's in the Terrace Public Library, but it's definitely worth reading. And it's not particularly specialized. It's for average reading level. The Sixth Extinction. And it is the sixth of its kind. The fifth one was the one that wiped out the dinosaurs.
So what changes in the Anthropocene?
The Anthropocene. That should probably have been a word that to appear in the manifesto. I think maybe it's a little bit too recent in its origin. The Anthropocene, for those of you who haven't heard it, is a term that is now starting to be agreed on in scientific circles as the current era marked by unprecedented human impact to an extent that we're actually changing the entire planet. The opposite, or the preceding era, was the Holocene, which was marked by a very nicely constant environmental set of conditions, particularly temperature and climate was very nice and constant and comfortable, and lasted for about 10,000 years, allowed our civilization to develop and evolve, and that changed in the late 20th century, and we're now in that Anthropocene, which basically is creating a different planet, whether we like that or not, but we're on a different planet now, and it's becoming more different by the day. The Manifesto deals with some aspects of that different planet, but not nearly enough of them. I think that's what I'm hearing from your comments as well.
Maybe we should close things off there. Many things in the discussion and the presentation I see bear a significant overlap with positions of the various federal political parties, so you may have an opportunity to invoke your own action plans next Monday, Election Day, if you have not voted already. But please join me in thanking Alex for his presentation today. I think you already have a UNBC mug, so here's another little souvenir. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming and for making this interactive.
Just go to the first slide.
First slide?
Could you wait?